Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everybody here. For some of you who have been wondering perhaps what we were doing today here, it's build up a set for a project. That's better. We're building up a set for a project that will last for 2 weeks here in the Lakeside Foyer, and partly also in the old bookshop later with performances. And it's part of a research and residency of choreographer from Broek, who is sitting next to me here. Already worked at the Barbican 2 years ago during an exhibition called Station to Station. And this is the first of a project that will continue over the next 3 years. Several steps. Today, this residency specifically has a theme, memory loss, or memory. And apart from working with the group who is here, dancers, performers, musicians, technicians, we also invited other artists. And today we have Dr. Simon Lovestone here. Dr. Lovestone is connected to the University of Oxford as a professor in neuroscience. Is that correct? And today he will give a lecture about dementia to us. After that we will have a talk. We're aware that the sound cannot be heard everywhere, but if you're interested you can approach us, so it will be a bit better. So first we will start with the lecture, and afterwards we will have a talk, and people can ask questions. So you're very welcome to come over here. Now I would like to give the word to you.
Thank you. So hello, it's nice to meet you all. I've spoken about dementia to all sorts of audiences, and this is one of the more interesting ones because I'm really interested to see how you will take what I have to say to you. But rather than give you a lecture, I would much rather we have a conversation. So I'm going to start talking to some slides, but I'm very happy to stop and have a discussion at any point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a potted history of dementia. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're so worried about dementia as communities, and we should be as communities as well as individuals. I'll tell you a little bit about what we mean by dementia. I will teach you, as if you're medical students, about the different kinds of dementia. They are somewhat distinct. And then I'll get into some of the science, if we have time. The science is about molecules. I'll show you some fruit flies with Alzheimer's disease, and we'll get really into the weeds. I hope I won't stay in the weeds for too long, because I want to end with the future. So the future being getting rid of Alzheimer's disease, which I think is possible within my lifetime. So we'll see. So I'm going to start by giving you, as we're doing the potted history of dementia, a little bit of a history lesson. So let's go back to May 8th, 1945. I don't want to do too much testing, but does anybody know what this date was? Why this was important? Yeah, this was the end of the war. So this was a really important time for Europe. And where we are now, in the Barbican and East London, this was, well, one can only imagine. So let's listen.
In the Dutch Whitehall, fully 50,000 people, like millions all over the country, gave themselves over to unbounded rejoicing. If anybody still believed that we didn't know how to enjoy ourselves, these victory days disproved them once and for all. When night fell, there were still the great crowds, bigger than ever. All London made a night of it. Piccadilly Circus was the centre of it all.
Only just imagine what that was like. The people were celebrating because the war was over. The troops were coming back, handsome young men in uniform. What do you think happened?
Lots of babies were made.
9 months or so later, there were lots of babies appeared. And that is actually what actually happened. That was the start of the baby boomer generation, literally on that day, which was February 1946, was the start of the baby boomer generation. And as it happens, I was born in February about 15 years later in 1961, and that was literally the end of the baby boomer. The month I was born after that, the numbers of babies being born started to decrease. So there was a massive change in the population, literally starting on the night of VE Day and continuing until 1961 when I was born. And now our populations all over Europe are decreasing. Well, why does this matter in the context of dementia? It matters because the first of the baby boomer generation that were born 9 months after VE Day started to become senior citizens and get their pensions just a few years ago. So this generation was born. The baby boomer hit their pension age. The silver surfers were, suddenly there were large numbers of older people in all of our communities across all of Europe. And this has huge implications for us all and for how we're going to live the next 15 or 20 years. So from a scientific perspective, this is how we measure these. So these are population diagrams, and the one on the left is the population diagram from a few years ago, and the one on the right is the population diagram that we're heading to. So each one of those levels represents a different age. So starting from teenagers and going up to the very elderly. And as you can see, some years ago, it was people of working age that were the biggest single grouping of ages. And as we move forward, and this is the time we're entering into, increasingly it's going to be the elderly, those people who are beyond what we now think of as working age, the retired, who are going to constitute the majority of our population. This has huge implications for us. It has economic implications, but it also has implications to how we run our lives, what it means to be a European in years to come. And because the single most important disease that affects older people today is dementia. So today there are more than 850,000 people with dementia living in the UK alone today, and by 2050 there's going to be more than 1 million. So the numbers are going to increase hugely. Worldwide there are more than 44 million people with dementia. This is important. And the reason why it's important is primarily to those individuals that are affected. But if you think of it as concentric circles, at the middle is the person affected with dementia. And I'll try and tell you a little bit about the symptoms of dementia later. But then you have the family that is looking after that person with dementia. And then you have the community that that family live in. And then you have nation states, countries. And Alzheimer's disease, dementia, costs more than heart disease and cancer combined. It's one of the single biggest costs. And I know we shouldn't be just thinking about pounds and euros, but actually it's rather important. And especially as we, the baby boomers, get older, it's going to be you, the generation that come after, that are paying for our care. So it's important for me, it's also important for you. And today, in the UK alone, it costs more than £20 billion a year to look after people with dementia. As I say, that's more than all of the cost of looking after everybody with heart disease or Alzheimer's disease. Taken another way, if you take the world's GDP, so everything that mankind produces, 1% of that goes on looking after people with dementia. So a measurable and significant amount of humankind's productivity is spent on this disease. How terrible is that? And if you were to turn dementia into a country, then the GDP of the United States of dementia would be the 18th biggest economy in the world. If you turned into a company, then the turnover of the company of Dementia Incorporated would be biggest company that exists on the planet today, probably twice as big as ExxonMobil. What a tragedy for the individuals, for the families, for the communities, but actually for mankind. What a terrible waste of resource. If only we could get rid of this disorder, wouldn't we all be better? So what is this disorder? Let's go back 100 years in our history to when these two people were alive. The person on your left-hand side is Alzheimer, Herr Dr. Alzheimer, and he was working in Germany, and he looked after the person on your right-hand side, and her name was Augusta Dieter. And she was in effect the first person with Alzheimer's disease. Because Alzheimer took her seriously, and he recorded what he found in her really carefully. He did what good doctors do today. And actually medicine hasn't changed that much with all our amazing technologies and our wonderful machines. The intervention that we have that is most important is simply listening to people and talking to people. And he used his ears and his brain to try and understand her condition. And just a few years ago, the medical notes of Augusta Dieter were found. And inside those medical notes was the handwriting of Alzheimer that you can see up there. And this is just a little clip. I'll read it out because for me as a doctor today, seeing patients every week in the clinic, this is very resonant. And I can see the patients that I look after in his writings. So he writes about Augusta Dieter. She sits on the bed with a helpless expression. And he asks her, "What is your name?" "Augusta." "Your last name?" "Augusta." "What is your husband's name?" "Augusta, I think." "Your husband?" "Ah, my husband." She looks as if she didn't understand the question. "Are you married?" "To Augusta." "Mrs. Dieter?" "Yes, yes, Augusta Dieter." "How long have you been here?" She seems to be trying to remember. 3 weeks, she said. I think she'd been in the hospital actually for months and months by now. "What is this?" He shows her a pencil and she says a pen. "A purse, a key, a diary and a cigar are identified correctly, and at lunch she eats cauliflower and pork. Asked what she is eating, she answers spinach." And actually you can see lots of the symptoms that I as a doctor are trying to spot and record in my patients. So for example, when he asks her name, she gets it, Augusta, but then when he asks her to clarify her surname, she sticks on this Augusta. When he asks her about her husband, she says again Augusta. We call that perseveration. So it's as though the brain has locked onto something. Once it's locked onto something, it keeps on repeating it. And people with dementia find it hard to move from one subject to another. And that's one of the things I test when I'm with somebody with dementia. And then I wanted to read it out and give some emphasis because when he questions her about that, I think I can hear in his writing, she gets irritable. Yes, yes. He wouldn't record that for no reason. And it must be incredibly distressing and upsetting to have dementia. None of us like to be questioned. And so when you question people with dementia and ask them to clarify, sometimes they too become agitated. As they get worse, and we'll come on to this later, they need lots of help, maybe help in dressing and putting their clothes on or eating, and not surprisingly, people become very distressed and irritable at that time. So sometimes it's said that people with dementia have behavioural problems. Sort of true, but they're not independent of things that are around them. If somebody tried to do up my shirt or my jacket, in all honesty, I'm going to get a bit irritated with that. I would today, and why wouldn't I when I'm old and with dementia? I think that's what's happening. So dementia is a term that is used to convey a syndrome, and by a syndrome I mean a collection of symptoms. And it's, if you like, an overarching term. But there are different diseases that cause dementia. And sometimes people get confused about what is dementia or what is Alzheimer's disease. The two are sometimes used synonymously. But dementia is the overarching term, and there are really a number of conditions that cause dementia, and they're all slightly different. And I'll tell you a little bit about them now. So these are the diseases that cause dementia, and the 4 common ones are Alzheimer's disease, which is by far and away the most common, which is why the 2 terms get used synonymously. The second most common is probably something called vascular dementia, after which there is something called dementia with Lewy bodies, and then there is frontotemporal dementia. And I'll tell you something about each of these conditions. In all honesty, they probably are a bit of a continuum, so a lot of patients have bits of each of these conditions, but as a doctor, one of my tasks is to try and say which of these disorders does somebody have, because it has implications for how they're going to progress, what their family need to do, and maybe also for treatments. So the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. There are more than this, but these are the core symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So first of all, as everybody knows, it's memory loss. But it's not just any kind of memory. The memory loss that is typical of Alzheimer's disease is memory loss for recent events rather than events in your past. So it is quite hard to remember what you had for breakfast, what you did this morning, what you did last week. It is quite easy to remember what you did months ago or maybe in your childhood. So let me tell you a story about this. Some years ago, it was a decade or so ago, I had a patient, and she was really quite advanced. She had quite moderately severe dementia. And I happened to notice in her notes that she had previously lived near where I lived in South London. So I commented on this, and she said, yes, I grew up, and she named a road. It happened to be the road I lived in at that time, so I was quite interested in that. So we had a little chat about this. I said, I live in this road, and it must have looked very different then. And I said, for instance, at the end of the road, now they're building a new building at the end of this road. And she said, oh, they can't do that. They are building. She said, no, they can't do that. They're not allowed to build at the end of the road. I said, well, they are. They, sort of maybe thought she's getting muddled and we should move on and talk about something else. But she became a bit agitated. And she said, you can't build there. It's dangerous to build there because of the river. I said, maybe I was a bit patronising. I still slightly regret this, but I said, there is no river at the end of our road. This is South London. I would know if there was a river. And we moved on to another subject. And then so it was probably some weeks later or months, I can't quite remember now. I looked at the map. There was a river at the end of my road that I didn't know existed. So I went and explored. You can't see a river because they're building on it and they've covered it over. The river is called the River Graveney. Actually, that is why the school that my children went to is called Graveney School, because of the river. And if you go just a bit further south from Tooting, where I live, you can see the river still. It's still there. And she was right. She remembered playing in the river 70 years before I saw her. She had a crystal clear memory that there was a river, and that river has been lost to those of us who live in this place now. So in some real sense, she knew more about where I lived than I did, even though she had quite severe dementia. It's because even though she barely knew her name, she didn't recognise her own relatives, her memory of being a child was really intact. There are also things called functional difficulties. So as a doctor, I split these into, we call them activities of daily living. They're things that you do every day of your life to get around the place. We switch them into, or we classify them as instrumental or basic. And we usually think of basic activities of daily living being lost in Alzheimer's disease. Can you get dressed? Can you feed yourself? Can you do all of the things that you and I don't even think about, brush your teeth? They're lost in people with dementia, and you notice their clothes are sometimes dishevelled, they might be dirty. People's self-care isn't so good, they're not brushing their teeth. I'll break into another anecdote. I'll tell you a story now. This was some work I did many years ago, working with children in a local school. And I went into this school with a fashionista. Didn't know what a fashionista was, but a fashionista is somebody who works in the fashion industry. And I gave them more or less the discussion or lecture that I'm giving you with some pupils. They were young teenagers. And then working with the fashionista, these underprivileged, diverse young people interpreted what I said as clothing. And they made mood boards, and they designed clothes, and there was a little competition that we had, and the best ones were chosen and were made up into actual garments, frocks. And there was then an actual fashion show with real models modeling. It was wonderful, beautiful. But the one that sticks in my mind was a teenager, a girl, a young woman who came from a, I understand, troubled background, perhaps maybe wasn't the best attender at school. And she got really engaged in this project, and she produced for me the most beautiful frock dress. It looked very strange. It was made out of denim, and the head came out of the arm, and the arms were undone and tied up at the back, and the whole thing was higgledy-piggledy. And what she heard from what I was telling them was people find it difficult to get dressed. And so she made a dress that personified for her the difficulty of somebody with basic activities of daily living. It showed the most extraordinary imagination and interpretation. And I spoke to her afterwards, and she told me that of course one of her grandparents had been affected, and so when I was telling her what I was telling her, it reflected her own lived experience in her family. Now, in the last 5 years, I suppose we're becoming more attuned to instrumental activities. So this is using equipment. And this is the sort of thing that we all do, of course, as well. And it's harder to do. And so it gets lost first. So as you were all setting up the stage, our colleagues, the tech guys, were doing some really complicated stuff with wires. And my guess is that they're obviously very good at it. You've chosen some great tech guys, but those are the kinds of things that get lost first. So one of the questions that I ask when I'm trying to detect whether somebody has instrumental activities of daily living, when I'm with an older person, I'll say, for example, I know that you can dress yourself and feed yourself, of course, but do you still use the washing machine in the same way? Do you ever make mistakes and you put in cottons with your woolens or your whites with your colours? And that is quite revealing, because people will say, actually I never used to, but now I do. And what I've learned is that for the currently older generation, that's a question that works really well for about half of my patients. The other half, they didn't even know they had a washing machine. So I need to work on that. But you get my drift. And what we're now trying to do is to devise devices using the iPhone and other things that measure instrumental activities of daily living better than we can currently do. So I've talked about memory loss and functional difficulty. I've talked a bit about behavioural symptoms. There are also mood symptoms. People show signs of depression, but also agitation and some other things as well. And then very typical, there are speech problems. These are speech problems of expression more than reception, meaning people will understand perfectly well, but will begin to find it difficult to express themselves. The very first thing to go is something I guarantee you will all have had. And that is the sensation of something being on the tip of your tongue. I can't quite remember the word for it. It's really annoying. But that is a very typical symptom of Alzheimer's disease, but much more severe than you would have suffered from. And it gets worse and worse. And then the other thing I'm looking for as a doctor, and that Alzheimer himself looked for, is a very gradual decline. So this is a decline that takes years and years, and maybe decades. But even so, it is relentless, and this is a difficult conversation that I have with patients and with their families every week in the clinic. From the time that somebody comes to see me to the time that they're likely to die on average is less than 10 years. It's about 7. And so this is in a very real sense a terminal condition. It's no way to sugar that pill. That's Alzheimer's disease. What about vascular dementia? It's very similar, but it is somewhat different. So first of all, I look for the signs of vascular disease, high blood pressure, having had a heart attack, maybe some episodes of stroke, maybe pain in the legs on walking, which is a sign of poor circulation. And then the memory loss is a little bit... I know, we've all had some of these symptoms. And then the pattern of memory loss is a little bit less predictable. So once somebody has Alzheimer's disease, I really know how it's going to pan out. With somebody with memory loss due to vascular dementia, they can have bits of memory that are perfectly intact and other bits of memory that are much less so. The functional difficulties are the same, but now may be complicated by the physical signs of stroke. You know what that will be. People with vascular dementia tend to be more likely to get depressed and slightly less likely to have speech problems. These are on averages. And the decline is very different. So people with vascular dementia can stay exactly the same for decades and then have a catastrophic worsening. And if you can picture it in your mind, it's as if there's a stepwise deterioration. And that is very, and sometimes patients will say, you know, it's as though he's going downstairs, which is very, very different to somebody with Alzheimer's disease, where if you live with them, you almost don't notice the difference. And then maybe you'll get together with your family at Christmas, and your siblings who don't see your mother as much as you will say, well, why didn't you tell me? She was so much worse. And you genuinely didn't notice because it's so slow. Symptoms of dementia with Lewy body. This is almost a new disease. This is a disease that we didn't know about until a few years ago. And it's a little bit like Alzheimer's disease, except there are periods of increased confusion. So somebody can get way worse and then get better over a period of days. So they can have a day or 2 or 3 when they're much worse, and it's very, very alarming when that happens, and then they'll get much better again. Typically, somebody will be admitted to hospital for other conditions multiple times before it dawns on the doctors. Do you know, this is just not confusion of being old. There's something else happening here. There are also very, very curious visual hallucinations. So this is seeing things that are not there. I'll tell you about another patient. This was an elderly man. I went to see him in his own home. He lived in Peckham in South London. And I was sitting with him in his ground floor flat, and he was looking out of the window, and I was finding it hard to bring his attention back to me and get him to talk to me. So, why do you keep on, no, look at me. Why are you looking out of your window? And he said, well, they're back again. What's back again? And he said, the men are back again. He looked out of the window, there were no men in his garden. So I gathered there was something wrong, and I asked him to tell me what he could see. And he described large numbers, 10s, 20s, he couldn't count them, more men than you could imagine, in his garden, and they were marching, and he used that term, up and down. I said, well, what do they look like? He said, they look like, they always look like. They've got this thing on and it's shiny, and they're wearing a little red skirt, and they've got a helmet on with a red thing going like this, and they're wearing... So I know what that looks like. And he said, they're the Roman soldiers back. And I said, that's odd, isn't it? He said, well, they come. They don't bother me. He said, you know the only thing that's a bit funny? I said, well, what's that? He said, they're small. So he saw Roman soldiers in his garden in Peckham that were little men like this marching up and down. And he was interested in them. He wasn't frightened, but he was curious by them. And this is absolutely things that would give you the screaming heebie-jeebies are looked at with curiosity and sometimes fear, of course. Very typical of dementia with Lewy body. And then people with this condition often have gait problems, so they don't walk in quite a normal way. So they'll make little steps and they'll often fall over when they try and turn. And they'll have a very typical tremor. So it's typical because they'll do this kind of movement, sometimes called a pill rolling tremor, because it looks as though I'm rolling a little thing in between my finger and thumb. And they'll be doing this sort of thing until you ask them to do something, and then it will stop. And they might just have a little tremor, but much less than when they're at rest. And that's a very typical sign of Parkinson's disease. Because dementia with Lewy body disease is in effect like Parkinson's disease, but it affects the part of the brain at the top of the brain that is mostly to do with thinking, rather than the base of the brain, which is due to movement. So they have a little bit of movement problem, but a lot of thinking problem. So I was telling you earlier, a few years ago, in an absolutely extraordinary performance, I should have looked this up. I think it was here at the Barbican, but maybe somebody in the audience saw this. It was a famous performance. Simon Russell Beale interpreted Lear as having dementia with Lewy bodies. You know the scene when he's on the moor and he's raging? Maybe he was having some visual hallucinations, and when he's with the beggar Tom, I think he talks about this. Maybe that's a sign that Shakespeare was conveying that Lear was having hallucinations. And of course, one other thing that we know about Lear is that his mental state fluctuated. So he has these outbursts. At the opening scene, when he's at the height of his powers and he's king still, he divides his kingdom up into three and gives it to his daughter. It's a crazy act, and it looks like a spontaneous act because he's having momentary or he's going through a bad patch. So beautifully, Beale interprets Lear as having dementia with Lewy bodies, and if you see, you can see on YouTube some of it, him talking to his director about this, and he interpreted Lear as having gait problems and a tremor. So he does this tremor, and that is because he's conveying, and it looked wonderful. And one of my proudest moments was last year as part of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death at the Olivier. I had a huge privilege of talking to Simon Russell Beale about his interpretation of getting old, of losing control, losing your mind, and just maybe Lear had dementia with Lewy bodies. Again, you can see that online if you search on YouTube. And finally, frontotemporal dementia. This often occurs to slightly younger people, by which I mean in their 50s and 60s. It has a much slower progression. Speech problems are more noticeable. People will become mute, completely unable to speak relatively early on, which is terrible. Can you imagine what it is like to be having real problems, but to be mute? And so the people that are looking after you think you have more problems than you actually have. You might want to be able to communicate with them and say, these are my needs, my wants, this is what I'm feeling, but you can't because you're mute. And on top of that, behavioural problems are worse. So the bit of the brain, this is a gross oversimplification, but the bit of the brain that deals with your social behaviour is at the front of your brain, and that is the bit of the brain that is most affected in frontotemporal dementia. That's why it's called that. And so your ability to behave socially is altered. That means that your behaviour can be grotesquely inappropriate. You might have hypersexualized behaviour. You might not know what's yours or mine, and you might steal, and you might take your clothes off, you might behave like the President of the United States. You might behave sorry, I withdraw that. You might behave entirely inappropriately. This can also run in families, and when it does so, it is very sad indeed, of course, because you not only then might see your relatives behaving in this tragic way, but you might then know what's coming for you. So with permission that I've had, I'll tell you just briefly about a patient of mine many years ago. She came from a family where this was known to run in families. She was a professional, highly accomplished, senior, very excellent in her own profession, and gradually it became apparent to her co-workers while she was still working that things were not right, and help was sought. And she did have some of these behaviours, these inappropriate social behaviours. She did run into some problems, including with authorities, and she stopped working, and we started to look after her. And one of my abiding memories of her is being in a facility for older people who were maybe 2 decades older than her, where she had needs and wants the same as you and I, but where she was unable to convey these because of her speech problems. But one of the things she did like to do was to paint. And she painted the same thing time and time. This, I should say, by the way, is her family tree, sort of suitably disguised, but also a scan of her brain. And what this is showing is this is the front of the brain up here. So this bit of the brain, and then the back bit of the brain, and the colour represents activity. And you can see activity being lost from the front of the brain. That is absolutely characteristic of this condition. So going back to the painting, she wasn't a professional painter, I hasten to add, but she did like to paint. And in this facility, she painted a horse that was on the wall. So somebody else, there was a poster or something of the horse. And she chose to paint that horse. And I collected some of her pictures. And I have pictures that I'm showing you now of more or less every couple of months over a period as she painted the horse. Starting from top left, you can see over a period of a couple of years actually, her ability to copy that horse just declined until at the end, at the bottom right, she has some blobs. You can see her abilities, her personality, her self almost disappearing. These conditions are a tragedy. So, let's go back to Alzheimer and Augusta Dieter. She died, and Alzheimer was a scientist at heart as well as a doctor, and he got hold of her brain, and he used a technology that was cutting-edge technology at the time. This was in 1906. And he used a technology that was, you must have been one of the very first group of scientists ever to use this technology. And it was now a routine. It's the ability to look down a microscope and see what is happening in the brain. Microscopes have been around for a long time. But if you look at the brain through a microscope, you can't actually see much until you stain it. It's a bit like photography. And a colleague of Alzheimer used silver to stain the brain, much as photography up until the advent of the iPhone used silver. So that's what photographic paper is. And Alzheimer drew what he saw. So this is what he saw from Augusta Dieter's brain. And he saw two things. He saw numerous small mineral foci which are found in the superior layers that are determined by the storage of a peculiar material in the brain. And then he said in the centre of an otherwise normal cell, there were one or two fibrils that stood out because of their characteristic thickness and peculiar impregnability. So, brace yourselves. because this is what I've spent the last 25 years of my life working on. And this is what I do every day. It's what I think about every day that I'm not at work. And actually, sometimes it's what I also dream about. This is what I've lived. So I don't mind you stopping me if this is not what you want to hear about. I'm going to give you some hard science now, but I'll try and make it intelligible as much as I can. But just bear in mind, if I fail, that is just I'm slightly over-invested in this. So again, with permission, this is the brain of a patient that I saw some years ago. And this is a modern microscope of what Alzheimer was seeing. In the left-hand side, there is something called a plaque. And in the bottom right-hand side, there are something called tangles. And I'm going to describe how the plaque is made, what we know about it, then how the tangles are made, and then a little bit about how we're trying to find drugs to stop these things. So the plaque is made up of a big protein called amyloid precursor protein. And there are a small number of scientists who started this work maybe 20 years ago. One of them, John Hardy, based in London. The other, Christine van Broek, who Anne knows well and is our connection. The gene that forms the protein, amyloid precursor protein, is sometimes altered. And when it's altered or mutated, it gives you Alzheimer's disease. Thankfully, this is enormously rare. Maybe less than 100 people in the UK, compared to 850,000 people with Alzheimer's disease. But these very rare instances are ways that we've learned about these conditions. Essentially, what happens, we now know, is this protein gets cut in two places by secretases, and a little peptide, so a bit of a protein, gets cut out. You would think that was fairly innocuous. It's happening in the brain all the time. But it so turns out that this little peptide is extraordinarily sticky, and it clumps together. You can almost watch it happening in the test tube. It's so sticky, it's really hard to work on because it sticks to the plastic of the test tube. And it's taken us a long time to work that one out. And what happens in the brain, when this little peptide gets cut out, it sticks to itself and it starts to form clumps. And those clumps get bigger, and then they get attacked by immune cells, and the brain suffers as a consequence. It doesn't happen quickly, but it is happening to all of us. It's happening to everybody in this room. It's a normal event. It just happens to some of us slightly more often than it happens to another one. And after 70 years, that's why some people get Alzheimer's disease and not others. So we, the scientific community, are trying to find drugs that stop this process from happening, or get rid of those little clumps from the brain. We're making 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, and I'll tell you what I mean by that later. This is a very bad pun. It's one my wife gave me, and I'm very grateful to her for that. It takes tau to tangle, because the tangles that Alzheimer saw are made up of a protein called tau. Now this is where it gets even more complicated. I'm going to tell you a little bit of neuroscience here. Partly because actually this is really interesting. Partly because you need to know a little bit of neuroscience in order to understand dementia. This is a brain cell. And this is the kind of brain cell that you learn about when you're at school. The important part of the brain cell is the sort of round, spidery thing at the top is this cell body where the nucleus is, and the thing that looks a bit like a root of a tree at the bottom, those are synapses. And these things can be quite big. In your brain, they can be that big. You've got one group of nerve cells which go from the base of your spine down to your toe. Dancers, this is really important to you because it can be damaged. When you get sciatica, that's what you're suffering from. You need to be strong and look after your limbs as dancers, and partly that's you're looking after that very, very long nerve cell. It is worth just taking a second to think how extraordinary this thing is. Most cells are 20 millionths of a metre big. This cell that you should be concerned about is a metre or so. It's a million times bigger than it should be. Even in they're hundreds of thousands of times bigger than they should be. And that's an amazing thing that's happened in evolution. And what evolution has done is work out a way of getting things that are made by the nucleus in the cell body down to the business end in the synapse. And in biological terms, that's incredible. You've got a system that is capable of moving things about at a dynamic range of either micrometers or a metre. In other words, you've got things, it's like you've got a public transport system that can move you around your home, and the same transport system can move you to Jupiter. We struggle to get a transport system that allows you just to move around London. It's really, really hard to make one type of transport system that will work for both kinds of things. So, that is really what it's like. It's like having a single transport system which will work to get you to the tube system and also then take you all the way to Jupiter. Very, very hard. The transport system is called the axonal cytoskeleton. That's what it looks like. It's a meshwork. And if you look really, really carefully, you can see little lumpy things in that meshwork. And those lumpy things are called vesicles. They're little sort of fat vesicles. And inside they have the things that you need to make your synapse work. And they move down that axonal transport system. I'm going to act that for you. But don't get too scared, because I've also got a video to show you what it's really like. The enabling thing is a motor. This is a nanomotor. What I'm telling you, I'm not making up. It really is like this. There is a protein that works as a motor that moves these things from the cell body down to and the motor looks like this. So it has 2 legs and 2 arms. The legs are attached to that networky-like thing, and the arms are holding the blobs, like Atlas. And the legs come off, and they literally step down the process. And so those blobs move down from the top of the cell to the bottom of the cell. And it really, really works like that. Is that going to work? That's a shame. So that was a gift. That was meant to be a video. It's worth looking for. It's beautiful. On the internet, you can see people describing it as, this is the molecular basis of happiness or love. It kind of is, but it is also the molecular basis of everything else that makes you a living organism. And that's true for little worms that don't have much happiness or love, as much as it's true for us. But there you can see the motor that I just acted, that pink thing, holding one of these vesicles and taking it beautifully down to the synapse, where it deposits it and it transmits its content to the next cell, which can... Why am I telling you all this? Well, I think it's a great piece of science, but this goes wrong in Alzheimer's disease, because that network that I showed you, that whole thing on which you're so dependent for everything that you think, is held together by the protein tau. That's what makes the thing stick together. So it's like you've got a railway line, and the sleepers, the wooden bits that hold the railway line in place, those sleepers are tau protein. And what happens in Alzheimer's disease, the little nuts that hold them together get unscrewed, all those sleepers get gathered up and stuck in a pile. That pile is what Alzheimer's saw in the brain of the Augusta Dita. And what happens to the railway lines? They don't work. They come apart. The trains don't run. The stuff doesn't go from the top of the cell to the bottom of the cell. The vesicle that contains happiness and everything else gets stuck, doesn't get, and you lose your memory. That is actually what happens to Alzheimer's disease. That's my cartoon of the process. So that's what I work on. And I've been trying to understand how that tau protein gets altered. We do experiments in, these are neurons, and the black colour is what happens in Alzheimer's disease. And in a Petri dish, I've cured Alzheimer's disease. I can get rid of that black colour, which is the tau protein going wrong. It's not what I really want to do. I don't want to cure a Petri dish. I want to cure people, but we're making progress. So then we want to go beyond the Petri dish, so we start looking at experimental animals. One of the things that we've worked on are fruit flies. So we made fruit flies have Alzheimer's disease. Now, of course, they don't have Alzheimer's disease, but they have some of the characteristics of Alzheimer's disease. And we look at the maggots of the fruit flies. So that's a normal fruit fly larva or maggot. You can see it crawling down. And in order to be able to crawl, stuff needs to go from the cell body to the synapse to make the muscles work. So then we gave it Alzheimer's disease. Obviously they don't have a memory problem, but they can't crawl so well. So that's easily measurable. So now I've got an experimental model in the laboratory that I can give drugs to and see if I can prevent it from getting Alzheimer's disease. So we did that. We gave them some drugs, and the black bars are what happens to the animal model itself, and the grey bars are treatments. So we can make these animals better. We've cured not just Alzheimer's in a Petri dish, but also in a fruit fly. That's still not what I want to do. So you have to go to a different kind of model. And for that we used mice. So here I want to tell you another bit of amazing neuroscience that it's important to understand. No, at this point I really don't know whether this will be of any value to you in putting together a piece of art. But for me, this kind of science contains real beauty as well as the kinds of things you do. This is, for me, has aesthetic qualities.
I can imagine that.
Thank you. So I'm now going to tell you about some high neuroscience called long-term potentiation. And this was understood for the first time in this city by somebody called Tim Bliss in 1973. It's an amazing, amazing discovery. We want to understand what is the cellular basis of memory? How is it that your brain actually remembers things? What Tim discovered was if you give a neuron, a brain cell, a little electric shock, you can measure a response. If you give it a little electric shock, you get a little response. If you give it another little electric shock, you get another response. It's the same size. You can do that for as long until you get really, really bored, and you get the same response all the time. If you give it a really big shock, and the way you do that is by going like that with electricity, so you give it lots of shocks, you get a really big response. That's not that surprising. But if you then give the neuron a little electric shock, you get a big response. The neuron has remembered that it's had a big shock previously. Slowly, over time, that memory goes over a period of about 2 hours. So the neuron has been potentiated, and it's long-term in our neuroscience sense, but it doesn't last forever. And we think that's how your memories work. You can see that in individual neurons, you can see it in worms, in flies, in mice. It's almost certainly happening in your brain. So if I give you something worthwhile to remember, you're firing lots of activity on your neurons, and that lots of activity is making memories. If I'm really, really boring, you're not getting many inputs. And if you don't get much inputs, you're not going to remember this.
So why do you remember random things?
Well, they may...
Why do you remember random things?
So the world is a strange place, and some of those random things might have real importance to you for reasons that you don't understand. I would love to be able to control my memory, but it turns out I can't. I remember the daftest of things I'd really rather forget, and I don't remember the things I want to remember, but there's something about my previous experiences that make those things important to me. And that is why you can't really understand memory at a molecular or cellular level alone. You do need to understand it in the context of the molecules, the cell, the organ of my brain, and me as a person. So I might remember that lady over there because I like the colour of her coat. I may not have even been conscious of that, but 3 or 4 days later, madam, I may find myself remembering you because I really do like the colour of your coat. And so you get those kind of apparently random, but maybe not so much. Going back to our mice. We took some mice that the genes have been altered that we think are involved in Alzheimer's disease, that might be involved in memory, but we took them when they were very, very young and before they had Alzheimer's disease. So these mice, when we were looking at them, had, to all intents and purposes, nothing wrong with them. But by putting an electrode, I need to say that the mice are cared for. I mean, I'm serious about this, are cared for very, very well indeed, much better than the small rodents that my children have had over many years in our own house. And you obviously have ethical approval for doing all of these studies. But we can put an electrode in the brains of these mice and we can measure long-term potentiation, which is what we did. So these are now mice, living mice, and this is what I was showing you before. We gave them a little shock and measured the output, and you get a little output. The mice barely know this is happening. It's a really tiny shock. Give them another one, they get another, and so on and so forth, until we give them a big one, and then they get a big output, and then we give them a little one, and they get a big output. Their neurons have remembered, and slowly that declines over time. Those are normal mice, and when we look at the mice whose genes are genetically engineered to look a little bit more like we think is happening in Alzheimer's disease, amazingly, they have distorted long-term potentiation. They get way less long-term potentiation. We think this is underlying what's going wrong in Alzheimer's disease. And then we gave them the drug, one of the drugs that we're currently working on, and we restored them. This is the green line. We restored them back to normal. What I want to convey for you is that we're tackling bit by bit the processes that we think are involved in Alzheimer's disease, and we're making progress. Not enough, but it's getting better. This is what's called functional plasticity. We're looking at plasticity in a scientific sense just means the ability to adapt to different circumstances. And we've shown that functional plasticity has something to do with Alzheimer's disease. Here we can also show we can look really now in real detail at the individual synapses. Those are the little things on stalks, and we can show, going back to that amyloid that Alzheimer discovered, if you treat neurons with the amyloid, you lose those individual stalks. You're killing those synapses. And again, this is work that Christine van Broekhoven has done. So we're now trying to understand that, and the very first drugs that were released for Alzheimer's disease work at that synapse between the connections of the two neurons, and they help the communication between two neurons. These drugs, I give them to my patients. They work a bit, but not enough. They help for a little bit, whilst the people have the ability to use them, but the disease itself continues its relentless path. So we need to get better. So just to recap, this is what I think is happening in Alzheimer's disease. Something to do with the environment that I haven't talked about yet, but head injury, diabetes, things like that increase your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, and maybe something to do with your genetic makeup. Also this thing called amyloid precursor protein, it gives rise to plaques and tangles and dementia. And there are other processes. You might reasonably ask me at this point, if you, the scientific community, know so much, can't you just make a drug? How hard can it be? it turns out very, very hard indeed. And worryingly, it's harder for Alzheimer's disease or brain disorders than for anything else. The brain is it's the most incredible, complicated, and also inaccessible organ. If you have cancer, I can put a needle in it and get the cells out and do experiments on your cancer in the dish, and it's very, very hard in Alzheimer's disease. The costs of producing a drug for Alzheimer's disease are mind-bogglingly high. Billions and billions of pounds, dollars, euros. And so far, we're not making much progress. The drugs that look most promising are, you might want to say, vaccines. So they're ways of inoculating the body against those amyloid clumps. And they have been developed and they have been tested in people. And a couple of years ago, these two important papers were produced, and these are really just to remind me about these studies. These were two clinical trials of vaccines, to use a shorthand, for Alzheimer's disease. I don't really know, but I'm told the cost of these trials, these two studies represent about $1 billion each. By anybody's account, that's a lot of money, even for the very large drug companies. They failed, so they didn't work. And there's only so many times we as a community can do that, either through our governments or our companies. And why did they fail? Well, we don't really know, of course, but I think we've developed too few drugs, so we've done too little. We've given the drugs too late in the disease, so we've given the drugs to people with dementia. I don't think that will work. Dementia, from when you come and see me in the clinic to when you die, is 5 to 10 years, I'm afraid. But actually the disease takes 10 or 20 years. So for at least 10 years, and probably 20 years before you come and see me, the disease is beginning to eat away in your brain. You don't know it because your brain is so amazingly capable of coping with a small amount of damage. And as I said, it's insidious, this damage, and you don't notice it, your brain copes. And that's a blessing, right? We wouldn't want our brain not to be able to cope, but what it does mean is by the time you come and see me, it's probably too late for the best possible drug. We also gave the drug to the wrong people. Turns out that a fifth of the people in these clinical studies actually didn't have Alzheimer's disease, they had something else. So 100 years after Alzheimer, we're still doing the same as Alzheimer did. We're still relying on people like me, my clinical skills, and it turns out they're not good enough. We need better ways of diagnosing the condition. So I'm going to end by how we're thinking about moving forward. This is a graph, a cartoon graph of how people decline with Alzheimer's disease. So there's a long, what we call preclinical period, where it's affecting people, but they don't have any symptoms. Then there's what I've called MCI, that stands for mild cognitive impairment. It's what anybody over the age of 60 will tell you happens to all of us. But some of those people will actually be having the very early preclinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And then there's a rapid decline of dementia. So where we need to do clinical trials is in that preclinical or MCI period. Actually, that's called secondary prevention. So what it means is giving a drug to somebody who's already got the disease but they don't know it in order to prevent them from getting symptoms. If you want to see the ideal candidate for a clinical trial of Alzheimer's disease, look at me. It's people in their mid-50s. We need to stop doing clinical trials of people with dementia and start doing clinical trials of people in their mid-50s who have no symptoms, no signs of Alzheimer's disease, but might be harbouring that disorder in their brain. might be me. So in order to do that really effectively, we need biomarkers. Let me get to where I want to get to. A biomarker is a test. And over the last few years, we've developed tests, and they're getting better and better. So we can do a special kind of brain scan, and we can now see in a living person what Alzheimer could only see in somebody who has deceased. We can see the plaques, we can see the tangles. It's expensive. It's not available all over the world. These are highly specialized techniques, but I make a prediction. It's what we'll be doing in the future. We can also do it with a needle in the back, like a spinal tap. And we can get what's called cerebral spinal fluid, and we can measure the biochemistry of those plaques and tangles. And in some parts of the world, Scandinavia in particular, that's now done as a routine. Here in London, it's not, but I think we need to get to the point where this is done more often than it's done now, at least for clinical trials. And now some really good news. In the last few years, we've started an amazing trial study. It's called the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease, and this, coupled with a data study, European Medical Information Framework, have been funded by the EU and pharmaceutical companies working together. These two studies alone, that I'll very briefly describe, have more than 120 million euros of funding. It's your money, it's taxpayers' money. If anybody wanted a reason for the UK to remain in the European Union, you're looking at it. But that aside, this is a step forward for doing research. Instead of being competition, in collaboration across companies and across funders. What we're doing now is we're taking people who are already involved in research, those are the cohorts. We're now doing those special brain scans and lumbar punctures. We'll have a group of people across Europe who agree beforehand to participate in clinical trials and have all of those biomarkers so we can start those clinical trials quicker. And instead of just comparing one drug to a placebo or a chalk tablet, we're going to compare lots of different drugs at the same time to a placebo. So if you're in this study, you're way more likely to have a drug than a placebo. Not only that, but before the study is completed, we'll have a look to see whether we think the drugs are working. If the drugs seem to be working, we'll continue. If the drug seems not to be working, we'll take people off the drug and put them on a drug that seems to be working. Why wouldn't you do that? This is called an adaptive clinical trial. It's rather complicated in terms of statistics, but in the field of cancer, this is now revolutionizing clinical development of anti-cancer drugs. And for the first time, we've now brought this process to Europe. And it's rather nice that our friends and colleagues in America are taking the lesson from us in Europe rather than the other way around. And a couple of years ago with my colleagues, I went to talk to policy people on Capitol Hill, and they've learned from this, and they actually incorporated our learning from public-private consortia in these two studies in something called the 21st Century Cures Act, which Obama introduced. We know what's happening to that now, but nonetheless, we've done it in Europe, and this is genuinely a revolutionary, transformative, use any cliche you like, way of doing clinical trials. I don't know whether this will work. I don't know whether this will be the answer or what will come next will be the answer, but I do honestly think that we're making progress. So what will the next 5 years look like? I think we'll see more drug development. I haven't mentioned, but in the UK we've set up 3 sites, one at Oxford that I lead, that is doing drug development for nearly the first time in university settings, with almost open access to this to try and speed up the process. We'll find better biomarkers or tests. They will, I predict, become incorporated as routine into research and maybe into clinical practice. And we'll be doing clinical trials, not in people like my grandparents, my much loved grandmother who had Alzheimer's disease, but more clinical trials in people like me who are at risk of getting Alzheimer's disease and are in their mid-50s and have the potential for a drug to actually work. What is our goal? I've wondered about this, and sometimes my colleagues, my peers who hear me say this say, that's too ambitious, you shouldn't raise hopes, we're not there yet. All of that is true, and I apologise in advance if it offends anybody of my peers. And what are we trying to do? I have spent the last 25 years of my life, and will spend the rest of my working life, doing nothing else other than seeking an end to Alzheimer's disease. I think it's achievable, and I don't think there's any better goal in science than trying to achieve it. That's all I have to say. I hope we can now have a conversation. I do want to note the importance of people who fund this research, and these are the people who fund my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lovestone. Thank you for listening all. We still have time for questions. I would like to ask Anne for a first reaction or a first question to... Maybe?
I'm still processing everything you're saying. Yeah, we got a lot of information, of course, but they'll say there are three stages in dementia. The starting phase, the in-between, the middle phase, I don't know how to say it in English, and then what they call it in Flemish or in Dutch, the verzonken fase, the sinking phase. And is it like that? And the sinking phase, that's actually where all the basic behavior and stops, or diminishes.
Yes, that's right. These are not hard and fast, distinct phases, but broadly speaking, there are three phases, yes, and we've now added another phase, the preclinical phase. So there's a long, 10 to 20 years preclinical phase, which is the kind of phase I may be in, and people from their mid-50s to mid-70s may be in, where it has absolutely no effects at all. And then there is the very, very early phase, which we sometimes call mild cognitive impairment or prodromal disease, when there are some memory problems, but not so many. And the difficulty with that phase is that as you get older, we all have memory problems, and they do get more frequent as you get older.
Yeah, I think it's hard to because a lot of times also in this time, even people of my age, I'm 46, you also forget a lot of things, but it's also because we have to remember a lot, and we have to be busy with a million things, and so it's hard to, I think, to get also the symptoms.
Yes, and I can't do that as a doctor. I don't know it myself. So, like you, I have memory, lapses. I forget the names of people. I forget to go to meetings. If it's not on my phone, then it doesn't happen as far as I'm concerned. And I can't tell. I just don't know. Is that because I'm super busy and I'm in my mid-50s? Or is it something worse than that? I don't know, and nobody can tell.
When do things become alarming? When do people reach you? Because that's already quite a bit further down.
Yes. So then that takes us to the next phase, and the next phase is when it is detectable by a doctor and by the person themselves, and it starts usually with this instrumental activities of daily living. People make mistakes. They may make driving errors, which of course is a big concern to me as a doctor. Everything takes a little bit long. They walk into a room and they forget where they've come, they put their glasses in, those kind of lapses. Again, there's a smooth range to normal, to no disease, but everything just gets that bit worse and mistakes start to be in people's ordinary lives, get made. We're trying to measure that using computers and using the iPhone. We're trying to get better at can we detect those early changes. But that is the start of proper dementia. And people do notice this happening to them. There is a qualitative difference. Their ability to articulate, words begin to get lost, language gets somewhat more rudimentary. People have analysed the language of authors and their books they've written up until the point that they have dementia, and they find that the language, as a reader I may not notice, but when you do the complex analytics on the language, maybe it's a little less expressive, the vocabulary becomes a little bit more limited, and that's the very early stages. And then people enter the second stage of dementia, the proper stage, when it is obvious. It's obvious to them, it's obvious to the people around them, they need help, they're engaged with services, they will genuinely find it difficult to do the normal activities of daily living, and they might need help in getting dressed, and there is that. And then there is the final phase, and the final phase is more like a cliff. And people will get physically sick during that stage as well, for reasons we don't quite understand. And that stage tends to be very, very fast indeed, the terminal phase.
Yeah. For example, my mother, not Alzheimer's, I think, but had dementia, and that really went into totally the end. I mean, after a while, she also didn't know anymore what is swallowing, what is biting in food, what is goes so far, and of course, then people don't eat anymore, and you cannot force it into them, and it's also very hard, I think, for the nurses and the carers to, how to deal with that.
It's very difficult indeed. And the best nurses and people and family members learn ways of interacting with someone, and some of those can be taught. So let me give you an instance of what I mean. If you were with somebody with dementia, when I was in training, every ward in the hospital with people with dementia would have a big board on which would say what the day was, what the weather was, and a few facts like this. And people with dementia were made to kind of look at it and see if they could remember in the understandable but I think mistaken idea that it did some good. My feeling about that is, why do you need to know what day of the week it is? I mean, who cares if you're in a facility? And there is a very nice book by a woman called Naomi Fail, I can't remember. And the story is that her father was a psychiatrist, and they lived in a psychiatric institution when she was young. And she learned a way of interacting with people with mental health problems, including with dementia. And then she turned that into a therapy. It's called revalidation therapy. So typically, in the past, if somebody with dementia makes a mistake, a memory mistake, let's say they're in a day centre and they say, I've got to go home because my husband will be coming back from work and I've got to make him dinner. Typically, in the past, the response of the care staff, meaning well, would be, no, you have to stay here with us because your husband died 10 years ago. He's not working and you're not making him dinner. Stay with us. Naomi Vale pointed out this is not nice. Of course the person becomes distressed because you've told them all over again that she's a widow and anyway she wants to go home. It's not her lived experience. And so instead, revalidation therapy would be to respond, instead of giving her the ground truth, which is quite harsh, you might respond, you must miss your husband very much. Because with an understanding that the person with dementia who's saying, I want to go home to see my husband to feed him, is actually expressing a longing for her husband who is long gone. It's perfectly right and normal, and you and I would have that same sentiment. It's just we would understand it in context, and the person with dementia doesn't. So if you respond rather than trying to get them to understand your reality, but instead acknowledge their reality. You're revalidating their experience, and actually it works. It doesn't make the person with dementia better. Of course it doesn't. It's not meant to, but it's a way of communicating with people with dementia that respects their own reality, whilst also making it possible to have a communication with them. It's beautiful when you see it in action.
Thank you. I see a lot of people listening for quite a while. Yes, absolutely. But I first want to ask if somebody has a question. This moment. Up to you.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth. I'd like to ask whether in the stage of preclinical stage, is anything in personality of person that can prompt us that in future this person would suffer dementia? I suppose you made such an observation. It is my first question. Second question is whether I read that it is that various dementia, type of dementia can overlap. How do we know it from? Whether it is only our way of thinking. And third thing I'd like to say.
You might have to remind me of this.
And third thing, I think that this revalidation, which you said, I have never heard about it. But intuitively, from my experience, I think that is a very good tool of dealing with people with dementia, because with Alzheimer's dementia, because it really works. And it makes them feel better instead of worse. First, it was a question about preclinical symptoms.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, a very astute question about personality. A student with me did some research on that some years ago, and there are one or two other groups around the world that have looked for personality traits in people in middle age that might be predictive of Alzheimer's disease in later life. I'm not convinced by our own studies. However, our own studies suggested that yes, there were some personality characteristics. I don't like the terminology that psychology uses for personality characteristics, but one which the psychologists think of as neuroticism, that we all understand, I think, a little bit about what being neurotic means, worrying and that kind of thing, seems to be more common in people who subsequently go on to get Alzheimer's disease. The caveat is these are rather small studies, and they are incredibly difficult to do. How do you measure somebody's personality from 20 or 30 years ago? It's really, really very difficult. We tried very hard. We found that result. Other people have found that result, so it might be true, but I'm not completely convinced. But it is a really interesting question. And the reason why we were looking at that, possibly the reason why it came to your mind, is because our personality might just be the most sensitive measure to very early change before people have memory problems, which are quite a late stage. Your second question was about, I remember, it was about mixed dementias. I think actually that's probably more common than separate dementias. So I described the 4 common forms of dementia as if they're completely different. The more we look into this, the more it seems there's an overlap, especially between Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. It's probably more common to have a bit of both than to have either one completely separate to the other. And the way that that's been discovered was from looking at the brains of people that die with Alzheimer's disease. And one of the most generous acts that people can make is donating their brain, but whilst in life. So volunteering the brain to go for science study after you die. And in the UK, there is a network called Brains for Dementia Research, which was set up for people to do that. So it's a very generous act. And we're discovering things from that already, such as how common mixed dementia is. For me as a scientist, where that's taking us is I make another prediction. This one is I'm less confident of, but I think it is probable that in the future we won't give one drug for dementia, but we'll have a drug for Alzheimer's disease and maybe a drug that helps with vascular, or helps to prevent vascular dementia, and another one that helps to prevent Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies. And so then my task as a doctor is to say, well, how much of risk for each of these do you have, or how much of these different pathologies are you already developing? And then this is the mixture of drugs that is going to be just right for you. And that's a kind of medicine that is sometimes called precision or personalised medicine. There aren't many examples of that anywhere in medicine at the moment, but there are a few, and the field of breast cancer is one, where there are some breast cancers where you should take this drug, and other breast cancers where you should take that drug. I expect the same to happen one day for Alzheimer's disease. Your last comment on revalidation therapy, I completely agree. There isn't one solution to any of these things. It is just a tool in the toolbox. But I would like all of those professionals who look after people with dementia to be funded well enough to have the time to practice these tools, for the institutions to train our carers in these various tools. And I would like us to see no patient with dementia looked after either by the state or by private institutions, except by people who are equipped to use these tools with care, with love, and with professionalism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to ask if one of the performers, perhaps they all have, who wants to?
Well, I was wondering because I found very interesting also for the preclinical stage phase. Is there, like, for example, these days it's very important to live healthy. It's been promoted a lot also for training the body physical. Is there proof that, for example, training your brain also could help not to get in the stage of getting dementia, like for example to do memory games and stuff or whatever? Is there some proof of this to like prepare it for yourself in a way?
So there is now a huge amount of research that shows that doing Sudoku regularly makes you much better at doing Sudoku. And not much else. So it turns out that training the brain is very unique in helping you to train just at one task. And actually this is different to other things. I was reading a blog a couple of days ago that pointed this out. If you train a muscle with weights, then that muscle gets good at doing everything that that muscle does. It doesn't just get better at lifting weights, it gets better at pushing bricks, it gets better at lifting yourself off the chair, it gets better at everything that muscle needs to do. If you train the brain to do Sudoku, or by using Sudoku, it just gets better at Sudoku, not at anything else. So brain training in that sense really doesn't work. However, the most complicated thing you can do at all is go to a committee meeting. Or maybe have Christmas with your family. And by that I mean the most complicated thing a human does is live in a social group. Whenever we're in a social group, we're doing quite complex tasks. So I'm talking, you're thinking, how on earth do I respond to that? And what is she thinking? You're thinking, don't ask me to ask a question because I haven't got a question to ask yet. And you're wondering when I come to you. And in doing all of those things, your brain is really working in overdrive. When you're in a committee meeting, well, maybe that's not so complicated, but still you're thinking about what, at Christmas time with your family, you know, you've got your in-laws who maybe you don't like so much, and you're wondering about the present that so-and-so gave you, and what does that mean, because she knows I don't like that sort of thing. And then you're wondering, how on earth can I get out of this place? And is you know what it's like. That is a really, really complex thing your brain is doing. And it happens to us all the time. So if you really want to work your brain hard, you should go out there. Spend time with communities. Talk to people. And actually there is a little bit of research that also shows that encouraging older people to live in social groups, to do activities, it almost doesn't matter what, is somewhat helpful. There are other things that you can do in your mid-50s, mid-60s, and mid-70s that might help. Might is important. As a scientist, I need to say that. So there is some evidence that cardiac, things that make your heart less good, increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes definitely increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So if you want to protect yourself, it's a really good idea to protect yourself from diabetes and heart disease. And to do that, you need to eat broccoli, go for a run, and lose weight. And by broccoli, I mean, eat a healthy diet. By go for a run, I mean do exercise. And by lose weight, it means, our weights are all going up, and you need to stay at a reasonable level of body mass index. Keep your waist circumference low. In all honesty, although the risk of cardiac disease and diabetes is associated with Alzheimer's disease, if you do what I've just told you, will you actually protect you from getting Alzheimer's disease? If I put my hand on my scientific heart, I can't guarantee it. The evidence that an intervention will make a difference, it's not quite there yet, but it will do you good anyway, so do it. You're not going to get heart disease, you're not going to get diabetes. What's not to like? You're going to feel better. And it just might help prevent you from getting dementia. So it's a really, really good thing to do. And stay social. Can I ask a question of all of you? How on earth do you take some of these things and begin to turn it into an expressive art form?
I think it's the same as what you have when you're, trying to find everything with the mice and into the Petri scale, and it's the same. Now at this moment I'm also just processing, and then sometimes I hear a word or I see an image, and it can be very stupid things. It can be a picture of one of the pictures you showed. It's and then slow by slow, it's like a lot of times I compare it also with science or a researcher. Yeah, an artist, you want to get to that point, and every creation you have the feeling you're not there, and you keep on. And I have it with a lot of things in my work around emotions. My work is really around emotions and how do we live together, and being non-eternal, and it's the same as you. So it's now still, it's a little, when you get a little light and a little idea, and then something falls at its place. It's like finding a solution for a millimeter, for 1 millisecond, and then the next thing comes.
So I can't wait to see how you interpret some of these things. Some years ago I worked with the opera company, who was a modern opera company, and they did an opera called The Lion's Face on Alzheimer's disease, and they did one thing which you can't do because it's a different art form, of course, but for me it was really powerful. They had a device, so I did this kind of thing, I talked to them and a bit, but they had a device that they came up with such that all of the players sang, except for the person with dementia who spoke. And of course, when you're listening to opera, it's really quite hard to understand the libretto, understand the words of people who are singing. You have to really concentrate hard, whereas the speech is really easy to understand. So they took the normal situation of Alzheimer's disease and inverted it, which was, I thought, a clever device. So you found yourself concentrating hard on the people without Alzheimer's disease, but implicitly understanding the person with dementia. And that somehow drew you in, or drew me in, to the person with dementia's world in a way that I, as a scientist and doctor, found helped then me in my work, maybe just a bit. You know, if you can do something in your artwork that helps, so what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is it's not unidirectional. When these kind of things work, then you help us to see what we're trying to look for too.
Well, I don't know if that's gonna be the case, but yeah. But yeah, for me, also especially about the whole, I'm really wondering if people who are having the dementia, what their living world is. And it's impossible to find out, of course. It's very hard to...
Yeah, it is intrinsically impossible to find that one doesn't know. I can tell you the story we tell ourselves, and I hope it's true. The story we professionals tell ourselves is one of the very first symptoms to go is an awareness that you have memory problems. And for people with established dementia, that's true. And if there's a failure to recognise that you have a problem, you probably don't get too distressed by having that problem. And in my own family, with my grandmother, I think that when she had fully established dementia, that was true. As far as I could tell, she wasn't in a distressed state, but I didn't really have full access to her mind. So that's the story we tell ourselves, and I think it's true, and I hope it's true, but it isn't the whole truth. And the more we spend time with people in that pre-clinical phase, and then in the intermediate phase, the more we know that there is a time when people are only too aware of what is happening, and whether they articulate that in language that I would use, medical language or something else, you know, there is a time when people do know what's happening to them, and that is unremittingly awful. What can you say? It's terrible.
Yeah. Something, it sounds like a minor detail, but I also heard it was from the weekend, the Museum of Modern Art in Antwerp. There they do the guidance tours with young dement people. And we were also talking, we were also the guidelines for the guides with young dement people and their caretakers. And one of the things was also with sound, and also, for example, if there was a video installation of art, or not too many, like sometimes a lot of sound would really stress them out. And also the same with video images, changing over very fast. And also items also in a painting or something that have a lot of details that you may not focus on. I mean, they do it themselves, but I don't know if you have certain also sound and music and...
Yes, so I think so. There's a negative and a positive. The negative is complex sensory input becomes more distressing. So you need a certain amount of cognitive ability to interpret sensory input, and you know, that just becomes harder as you're losing memory. And if it's hard and you can't interpret it, it's stressing. You know that symptom that pretty much everybody's had to some degree or other. You're in a noisy room and it's really, really hard to hear somebody until you hear your name mentioned, and then you hear that perfectly clearly. What that's indicating is that it takes a lot of cognitive ability to interpret the sound you want to interpret when there are other sounds. And that difficulty in hearing what you want to hear or what you need to hear when there are other sounds becomes harder as you get older, as many of us know, and might actually be a very early sign of dementia as well. And then when somebody's in the established phase of dementia, bombard them with sensory input, it's distressing. That's negative. Positive, though, is the ability to appreciate smells, sounds, and have an aesthetic sense is retained early in dementia. And I think that that's really important. Now, I didn't know that about the Antwerp Museum. It's very interesting. Some years ago, when I led a community mental health team in South London, I became bothered by something. I would go into day centres or homes, and I would see groups of elderly people either watching the television, and that's obviously bad, but even when activities were arranged, they were often things like carpet bowls. So, you play bowls inside, and things that were okay if that's what you wanted to do. But my guess was many of those older people were a bit like me, and if they're anything like me, I don't want to spend the rest of my life playing carpet bowls. I'd like to do some more interesting things, please. So we then formed a little group, and my nursing colleagues took this group to the Dulwich Art Gallery. And once a week we took a group of older people with dementia, even quite advanced dementia, to the art gallery and spent a couple of hours there looking at pictures and talking about the pictures. And it wouldn't surprise anybody with any common sense, really. Of course they enjoyed it. Who would I enjoy it? Why wouldn't they enjoy it? So I think that we can use sensory input of all modalities for people with dementia. We can also use art to help explain, not even explain, but we can use art, I think, to communicate about dementia. I want to tell you another anecdotal story. Some years ago, so one of my daughters is now in her early 20s, and I'm guessing then she was in her mid-teens, so maybe a decade ago or less. We went to see the Turner Prize at the Tate. So this is a prize for, and it wasn't the winner, but one of the Turner Prize finalists was a video artist. And we went into this room, and there were, from memory, 4 or 5 different video installations, and me and my other daughter, we sat on the floor just because it takes a while to, what it's like to absorb the music. And one of the, and the artist whose name I can't remember, was doing this. It was all inspired by his grandmother. And his grandmother, the story went, used to like dancing. And one of the videos was a video loop of somebody dancing. In England, they're called tea dances, mid-afternoon dances that people in the 20s, 30s, I don't know when, used to go to, with sort of light ballroom dancing. And there was just a video, I seem to remember it was from the knee down, of some dancing going on. And it was sort of slightly out of focus, not very crisp. And there were a few other video things related to his grandmother. And we were watching this, we spent maybe 10 minutes absorbing this room. And then I turned to my daughter to say something, and she was crying, just gently crying. And she was moved literally to tears by this exhibit, because it was about his grandmother. Maybe she was thinking about my grandmother, her great-grandmother. She was thinking about people in our... I don't know what she was thinking. I asked her, she didn't really want to say. She'd be cross with me if she knew I was saying this. But it was just something about the dance and older people and memories. I just realised I've given you... You're going to have to do something that moves people to tears. That was not my intent. But my intent was... By doing, whoever this artist was, it was a brilliant piece of work. It did involve dance. It was about memory, but it was obliquely somehow about memory. It was incredibly moving. We all felt it.
Can you tell something about physical memory? How
About which memory?
physical memory?
What we sometimes call muscle memory, you mean?
For instance, yeah.
Yes. So when people talk about physical memories and muscle memories, they're usually talking about actions that they've learned that you do automatically on autopilot, as it were. They're often things that you learnt a very long time ago, so they're in the depths of your memory, and so because of that, they're often retained. So I said that people with Alzheimer's disease lose recent memories before they lose remote memories. I told you the anecdote of the lady who lived down the road with the river. It's the same for other things that you learned a long time ago. So physical memory might be one of them. If you've done a repeated task all your life, you're quite likely to remember that. That might mean doing up your shoelaces. So sometimes you might find a patient who has trouble getting dressed, but can do up their shoelaces. That seems counterintuitive, but the act of choosing what I'm going to wear, what goes with what, to remember to tuck my shirt in, is harder than just doing up my shoelace, which I do on autopilot. There are some other instances of remote memories that sometimes one sees. Sometimes people will, it appears as if they've almost acquired a foreign language. People, sometimes their relatives didn't know they've had. So if somebody's learned a language as a child, but never used it, maybe because they've moved country, sometimes they will lose the language of everyday life for the last 50 or 60 years, but retain their childhood memory of their mother tongue. It's remarkable when you see it.
Retain or re-access? Can you go back to it if you've forgotten it?
Yeah, so these things are not done by will, of course, and with somebody with dementia it's especially not returned. But the idea of a muscle memory or these early memories that are lost is they're in there somehow, and somehow you're now accessing them in a way that you didn't access them before, with the language example. Now maybe you didn't access it before because your current language overrides it, as it were. You probably could have re-accessed it if you really tried, or you had to. But when you strip away your current language, that earlier language re-emerges. It doesn't happen very often, but I think it's almost analogous to a muscle memory.
How does that, maybe one of you can answer that, how does it work for your physical memory? When you, for instance, have learned a choreography and haven't danced it for a couple of years, or?
Yeah, I don't know, for me, yeah, sometimes we say you are an autopilot when it comes to the physical memory, but I think it's with dance, it's more than you just do it so many times and you repeat it so much, and that's how it gets into the memory, I think.
What would you say?
That you have different memory in the gesture. For me, what works the best is weights in the movements. I remember the weight and I remember the energy in the movement. I don't remember the counts or the music after a while, but I remember it had that connection to that person, or the weight, or the intention. Maybe I don't remember exactly the shape of it, but it had that weight for sure. So there is a link to gravity. Memory and gravity in the body is really something very strong. And space and connections. So it can be triggered by other people that you encounter on stage and how you relate to them, that will make you remember a whole block, or the space you would use normally. I would be reversed to the audience point of view. I would be using the back point of view. And then you reopen a whole memory field. Voila.
And my prediction then is that sense of weight, that response to others in your proximity, is something that is more likely to be retained a long time after you practice dance. Because it's kind of burned in.
Yeah. So that's the skill that you need, or that you develop very strong.
Yeah, for example, if a child learns dancing or playing an instrument from 8 years old to 9 years old, it's more likely that they know. So even if they get demented, those things will kind of
and it just becomes harder to learn new tricks as you get older. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think the muscle memory and all these things, there's nothing special about dementia there. These are universal human experiences, but it's almost as though they're writ large and made more extreme by the memory loss that comes with dementia.
I have one question about what you observed on people, how they interact with their own space. What did you notice something very specific, characteristic to the use of space and time for those people, like how they would move, how they would act in very characteristic way that are really recognizable of that disease as dementia?
That is a very nice question. So there are some ways that people move with different kinds of dementia that are not characteristic but sort of indicative. So there's the tremor of dementia with Lewy bodies. There's a particular walk which is called a marche à petits pas, the walk of little steps, which people with some forms of vascular dementia can make. There is a difficulty in turning corners that people with dementia with Lewy body make, and they look as though they might topple over, and sometimes they do. Again, people with dementia with Lewy bodies have a difficulty in initiating movements, so it's always as though you can see the sort of mental strain. It isn't actually, but it's they just can't get the body to move in the way they want. And then once they're up and going, that's fine. And then but with Alzheimer's disease, there's nothing typical. But with all dementias, the way people interact with others becomes altered. So people with Alzheimer's disease in the more advanced space often lose a degree of inhibition about personal space. So forgive me, I'm role-playing. Don't mean to invade your personal space. Somebody with Alzheimer's disease, you're the doctor, I'm the patient. That's a normal space, and we're both quite comfortable with that space. Somebody with Alzheimer's disease will often come closer for no apparent reason. The face may be just slightly uncomfortable, and they're often doing this for reasons I just don't understand. It's as if they're picking fluff off my clothes, and they'll do this, and then sometimes a bit of stroking, and sometimes that could be nice. So now I'll get as close as I'm going to get, and they will sometimes do this and stroke me, and that's lovely. I love it when that happens. But it is the first time it happens to somebody with dementia. Really? What's that about? And I could make up a story as to why they're doing it. I just don't know. I don't think it's as simple as I like you, I'm doing that. But so people with Alzheimer's disease often have this close interpersonal interactions. Sometimes it can be a little bit antagonistic, and but usually it's quite close and nice. Not universal, but it can happen. Well, sometimes people can be, they don't want me to come close. And especially if I'm a nurse and I'm trying to do something, they don't like that. But I have great sympathy with that. The nurse tried to do up my shirt or whatever, and I'm not going to get happy with that, even if I can't do it myself. There's one other thing which is very, very characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, super characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. And again, the people in the opera made something of this. It's got a very fancy Latin or Greek, I've no idea, but ancient name. It's autoprosopagnosia, which means a failure to recognize your own face. So you can imagine how that pans out. If you see a reflection of yourself, you don't know who it is, and you can interact with it. Sometimes in a bad way, sometimes in a good way. So I had a patient once who her general practitioner, her family doctor, thought that she might be having hallucinations. And it took a while for me to realise she wasn't. And what gave it away was her description. She said she only saw a face. She only saw the face in two places. One was when she was outside shopping, and then the face came and it went, and it came and it went, and it came and it went. And the other was in one room of her house. You're going to guess what room of the house it was. Her bathroom, because she saw it in the mirror. And the treatment was obviously not an antipsychotic, it was just take away the mirrors. And when she saw it outside, coming and going and coming and going, it was a reflection in the plate glass window of shops. Actually, I'll tell you something very nice that she said. She didn't mean to be funny, but it was one of the funniest things a patient's ever said to me. She said, so she often wore a sort of a knitted cap. And she said to me, "Doctor, I see this face." And she said, "It's this woman," and she said, "It's really strange because she wears the same cap as I do. But I know it's not me because she's so much older than I am." And you know, every day of my life I look in a mirror and I have the same feeling. So that's called autoprosopagnosia, and sometimes that is actually used to, in nursing homes will use it, they'll put a big mirror by a door that they don't want people with dementia to go through. Because what tends to happen, people will come up to the mirror, they'll see the image of themselves, not recognise it, maybe they'll have a conversation with it, maybe they'll see it as a bit threatening, or just somebody standing there, and then they'll turn around and walk away. It's called the mirror sign. It's a remarkable thing when you see it, but it's not uncommon.
Thank you. This has all been very interesting, and I think it's even brought a lot more questions, but I think we also could get to it. So, if you're prepared to take one more question, I could ask around it. Somebody from the audience, perhaps, or somebody from the group? Otherwise, we really want to thank you. It was very inspiring, and I think it was for the first afternoon a lot of inspiring thoughts.
I wish you luck. I think you're doing important work, and I can't wait to come and see the product in 3 years.
No, 1.5.
1.5. I can wait that long. I'm going to look forward to seeing it. Good luck.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you again.